Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer. Buddha at the Gas Pump is an ongoing series of interviews with spiritually awakening people. I have done about 425 of them now, and if this is new to you and you'd like to watch previous ones, go to batgap.com and look under the past interviews menu where you will see all the previous ones organized in various ways. This show is made possible by the support of appreciative listeners and viewers. So if you appreciate it and feel like supporting it in any amount, there's a PayPal button on every page of the site. And if you don't like PayPal, there's a donate page where you can see other ways of supporting it. My guests today are Kittisaro and Thanissara. I'm going to have them give us their own biographical background sketches rather than me just reading the thing they sent me, because I think it'll be more interesting if you hear them say it than if I read it. So, which of you would like to go first?
Hello, I don't know if it's here, it's early afternoon, but it's nice for us to have a chance to be at Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Kittisaro. I grew up in Tennessee with a Jewish father and a Southern Baptist mother. So that was unusual, and my life took me from a Southern military school where I was into wrestling up to Princeton in the Northeast, to Oxford.
And you were quite the wrestler. You were winning these regional championships and stuff.
Yeah, that was a very central part of who I felt I was. I was, with my body now, it's hard to...
Yeah, you don't look like much of a wrestler anymore.
And that's true, but I really loved it, and we had a region called the Mid-South. I was Mid-South champion, and then we went to a national tournament that I won, and that was, of course, Princeton is a great university, but they also had a very good wrestling team. So I went up there and got hurt very early on and needed a shoulder operation, and then when it looked like I would need another one, I realized I had to let wrestling go. Yeah. But I was going to go to medical school after Princeton, and I unexpectedly got a chance to go to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship. And it's when I went to Oxford that I then, in my studies of Aldous Huxley, then started learning a little bit about Buddhism. And I never made it back to medical school because in the middle of my thesis, it was a huge topic, art, science, and mysticism in the works of Aldous Huxley. But I was very interested in how these different modes of being inform each other. And in the middle of it, I heard about a great forest master in Thailand called Ajahn Chah. And I met someone who offered to take me, and I got a leave of absence from my scholarship and the thesis I was writing, and I ended up staying a Buddhist monk for 15 years in that Thai forest tradition, where later we got invited to start monasteries in England, and that's then where I met Thanissara. And we, after our monastic life, we then fell in love and left the monastery and were married in '92, and then have spent the last 23 years, a lot of that time in South Africa, running a hermitage there, and more being invited to teach in this country. So
good. Okay.
So at the moment we're in Massachusetts leading a retreat.
And obviously there are all kinds of other juicy details in there, like getting typhoid fever and being flat on your back for 3 years and stuff like that. But maybe we'll reference back to some of that stuff as we go. And how about you, Thanissara? Yeah,
hi everyone. My name's Thanissara. My background is from London. I'm originally from London. I grew up in an Anglo-Irish family. My father and his family, a large immigrant family from Dublin, and then my mother's side from the East End of London. And I was part of the working class, so I didn't really have a spectacular academic trajectory to go along. left school quite young and started work and tried to earn some money to go to college, and working as a domestic for a year or so in France, and then managed to put a portfolio through and go to art school. And it was at that art school that I started to come across alternative culture, and moved out of the family home and moved into a commune and started to explore meditation and alternative states of consciousness and alternative lifestyles. I also went to Krishnamurti a lot. He was in Brockwood Park at that time. We all went to go listen to him. It was in the 1970s. And I was very, very attracted to, I read everything that he read, but I had a dilemma about his pathless path, because I couldn't really kind of make that leap. And around that time, I started meditating, doing a lot of these very strict Burmese style retreats with the Goenka Ubakin school. And then around that time, I met Ajahn Chah when he first came to England, and then went to Thailand and considered ordaining. Eventually ordained back in England. Actually, today is the anniversary, 38 years ago, when I first took my first robes, actually in Britain, and became a nun and stayed as a nun, trained for 12 years in that forest school, helped build a couple of monasteries, were co-founded. You know, we were part of a team, a group, building the first monasteries in the UK. Left, as Kittisaro said, when we fell in love together and decided, you know, also more, I think, deeper currents that were leading us out of the monastery. And then we were invited to South Africa, and as he said, we taught there, taught in Europe and Israel, the last 20 odd years, 25 years or so. And then more recently, probably the last 8 years, been teaching more in the US. I was part of the Spirit Rock community Dharma leader training that went over 2 years, looking at diversity and bringing the Dharma out more into the culture. And I also trained as a therapeutic process when I realized I sort of really needed to backtrack and look at sort of deeper levels of wounding and understand the what happened. You know, teaching a lot, there's a lot of psychodynamic material that comes up. So I really want to have more skills around that. So now, you know, now we're setting up our own non-profit. We've set up our own non-profit in Sebastopol in the West Coast, and we're about to launch our own training next year, which will be around a synthesis of Mahayana, Theravada, psychospiritual work, but particularly looking at application of that work for the planetary emergency that we're in, how to respond to that, and at the heart of that, around the shift of consciousness needed. Not just what we do, but where we do it from a sort of separative consciousness to a more seamless understanding of reality.
That's great. There's a line from a Paul Simon song where it says, "My lack of education hasn't hurt me none." And I would say that with regard to you, you're an excellent writer. I really enjoyed reading your books.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. That was Kodachrome, by the way, that song. So I love, one thing I like about your books is I love the sort of activist emphasis that, you know, the sort of otherworldliness and renunciation quality that often comes across in spiritual circles. You've kind of moved beyond that, and you know, you're very concerned about the world. And as you were just sort of alluding to, I really think that the ultimate solution to the critical problems we face is a spiritual one. And so let's talk about that a bit today to maybe enliven that idea and collective consciousness even more.
Well, I think we first began to really open out into engaged Dharma practice when we were in South Africa. You know, we landed in a country that was still very impacted and still is impacted by colonialism and apartheid. And that felt like it generated obviously a lot of racial division, but internally, it also generated a lot of division and, you know, extreme discrepancy between wealth and poverty, very profoundly under-resourced communities that we were in the midst of in the rural KwaZulu-Natal. And at the heart of our time there in the late 1990s, we found ourselves in one of the centers of the pandemic of the AIDS crisis. So sitting on our zafus and teaching loving kindness and insight meditation really wasn't enough, and people were literally knocking on our doors wanting help. And so then we started to explore setting up projects and fundraising and training people to respond to the crisis when the government was in 10 years of denial. And I think also energized from that and coming back into the Northern Hemisphere and seeing that we had very quickly shifted into what we've always been aware of, but suddenly realizing that we're in a very serious situation with the climate and the increase of the warming of the biosphere and the implications of that. So that kind of led me into more, on the streets activism, and more recently going to Standing Rock and being engaged in trainings and looking at how we can bring the Buddhist community on board more as a collective. This is a very well-resourced community. Very, in many ways, entitled community, and that it's been very focused on individual awakening. So how could we more collectively respond? So that's still happening, and I think there's been a lot of shifts around that at speed in response, but perhaps not quite enough yet. But at the heart of it, what you're talking about, and I think it's very pertinent to people that will be watching Buddha at the Gas Pump, is even if we change the systems, clearly we need to change at systemic level, and that's happening already. But if we don't infuse those systems with a radical change of consciousness, then as the Buddha said, the fundamental nature of greed, hatred, and delusion, whatever system it picks up, that will be suffused through those structures. And the power dynamic, we obviously have a problem with a very exaggerated and isolated, inflated sense of self that is subsumed this sense of entitlement and power over of nature, of life, there's a hierarchy of power. That's one of the primary systems that we're in. People, humans over nature, over animals. The masculine over the feminine, white over people of color, so there's this kind of structure where we don't actually experience ourselves as part of a web of life. We're not really in the web of life anymore. So the realization that actually when we go into a meditative process and into the citta or the heart, that heart is not divided. The heart of pure awareness is sensitive and non-dual in its nature. It's the mano vijnana, the mind that goes out and discriminates and discerns and differentiates, which is necessary, and we use that mind, that has generated this vastly differentiated world and these structures that have divorced us really from a deep sense of belonging. And I think that lack of deep sense of belonging, deep sense of the sacred inherent within all of life is one of our core diseases and is leading to this extreme destruction that we're seeing.
Yeah. So to perhaps summarize what you just said, whatever we see in the world, whatever, that is in any way influenced by human activity is a reflection of the ambient collective consciousness that is created by the contribution of all 7 billion of us. And if there's, if we're seeing environmental devastation and economic inequity and all the other things you itemized, then those are just like symptoms of something in the collective consciousness that we all are creating. Just as a boil on the skin might be a symptom of some impurity in the blood or something. And so that people might despair in hearing that, because they might think, well, how are we going to get 7 billion people to change their consciousness? What difference can I make? Perhaps you could respond to that question.
Well, even when one person's consciousness changes, it can have a profound impact. We've spent much of the last 24 years in South Africa, and we were when we had left the monastery. We had no money, we were homeless, and being invited because of our meditative past. I'd been a monk 15 years, and Thanissara had been a nun. for about the same length of time. We would be invited to different places to teach the Dharma. And then an invitation came to come to South Africa, and we were supposed to arrive right after their elections back in '94. And our friends in the UK at the time said, "Oh, don't go there, it's going to be a bloodbath." But when we meditated on it, contemplated it, we thought we were being invited for a good purpose, to share and encourage, to share the Dhamma, encourage people to practice training the heart. We thought, why not go? And so we arrived right after the elections, and the country was in a euphoria at the time because the elections had gone surprisingly peacefully. But being in that land and having the impact of one person, like the leadership of Mandela, who famously said, when you harbor resentment, it's a little bit like drinking poison and hoping it will kill your enemies. He spent 27 years in a prison cell, and someone who just realized the need for forgiving and for including, and it was so we shouldn't. Sometimes when we so much try on the outer side to change things, we're coming from force, from desire, and not always in touch with the and appreciate the power of our being and our presence. And so that's one thing I really appreciate about my monastic training. When I was a wrestler, I just relied on willpower, and I could do more push-ups. I could do 500 push-ups a day and climb rope and walk on my hands for 100 yards and work harder than anybody. And I was, and same with studies. To me, getting to success was just through hard work. And it was in my monastic life when I ran into typhoid fever and just got flattened. I found that there's some things you can't just shift with willpower. And always, I realized before, I was always moving ahead to success as some place to get to. And that's this acquiring mind that generates a sense of the sacred is not here. There's a lack here. We're going to get to the good stuff, to success, by pushing, driving, and getting rid of what we shouldn't have. And it was in this profound surrender to a situation that I wouldn't have chosen, and with the help of the Buddhist teachings, to discover that actually all of this stuff that we take to be our life is arising and ceasing right inside this wide background of awareness, of consciousness. And that rather than us going through life, in a sense, life is manifesting through us. And it changes at the core there can have profound impacts around. And so, to me, that heartens me. I still want to be sensitive to what's going on in the world and try to encourage the good. But through seeing examples, like, for example, we have a friend who was one of Mr. Mandela's bodyguards. And so, as you probably remember, there was a lot of faction fighting and tribal warfare that was being even stirred up by the apartheid government, because they wanted to be able to say, see, these blacks, they can't rule, they just kill each other. And so when Mandela was the president from 94 to 99, in the province where we were staying, a lot of violence broke out in KZN, KwaZulu-Natal, in the town of Richmond. There was one faction killing people in Mr. Mandela's party, the African National Congress. And so Mandela, being who he is, he said, I want to go there. I want to speak to the people there. So our friend, his bodyguard, one of his bodyguards, went with him, and they drove to Richmond, and the place, the streets were full of people. And Mandela wanted to get out of the bulletproof presidential car and walk among the people. And the bodyguard and the other officers just said, Mr. President, you can't do that. They'll kill you. There had already been quite a few ANC members murdered. And Mr. Mandela, our friend recounts, Mr. Mandela said, if I can't walk down the streets of my own city, as the president of this country, he said, you might as well shoot me now. And he got out of the car, and the people were so touched and stunned. It sent this wave of being moved, that he was willing to make himself vulnerable,
yeah,
and trusting something deeper within the human nature. And so there's one person, and we say, oh well, how many Mandelas are there? Well, we shouldn't devalue ourselves. You know, that what we do when we learn to trust and know this place where everything comes together, where we sense our kinship with each other and with Mother Earth, that more mysterious things can happen. And so I think that it helps me return from a place of despair to something I can do.
yeah. I would suggest that perhaps Mandela and King and Gandhi and people like that, it's not like one person had this incredible leverage and just changed things single-handedly. It's that they themselves were representative of some kind of groundswell or shift that was taking place in collective consciousness, and they served in the capacity or the role of, you know, leader of this, representative of that, and being able to make decisions and be something that people could recognize, but that they were actually, well, I think I just said it, that they were an expression of some deep shift that was taking place in the collective.
They were, but also they had this. They had a training that enabled them to channel that. And you think of Mandela, fill that role at 27 years of transmuting what must have been an enormous amount of frustration and anger and hatred, and really, you know, they turning the prison into a university, knowing that eventually they would actually win, and preparing for that. But absolutely, he's not standing alone. But also, I think. The question of it doesn't need 7 billion of us to make the shifts. I think, you know, that theory of the tipping point, I can't remember what the percentage is, but it's not that much.
Well, there's different percentages in different systems. Like in the heart, 1% of the cells are called pacemaker cells, and they regulate the beating of the whole heart. And in some non-living systems, such as a laser or a magnet, or particularly a laser, the square root of 1% of the photons have to align coherently, and all the other photons will entrain with them. So it could be that rather small percentages of the population need to undergo a profound shift in order for the whole population, because they're functioning at a more fundamental level, and we know that if you can function at a more fundamental level, it influences the more superficial levels more effectively than if you're functioning on the surface.
Yeah. And you can see that with what's happening now in, say, in the US and across the world, where people are waking up very fast to the collective planetary emergency that we're in. That there's also an enormous amount of awakening happening.
Yeah,
you know, it's like the intensity of the situation, the crisis, a deep crisis, which is really a crisis of consciousness, of seeing ourselves as separate, really, from the web of life. I think that's fundamentally that dualistic consciousness, or separative consciousness, where we don't actually experience ourselves in an embodied way as part of within the deep sense of belonging web of life. There is that sense of alienation, and therefore all of the pathologies that have merged out of that. We're seeing that pathology at the extreme degree now in the political leaders. They're lost. They're degraded. They're soulless. They're purely after power. And the oligarchs, the tiny percent, trying to control and rule it all. And then underneath, you see this ferment happening, awakening and speeding up at great speed.
Yeah, we're also seeing, the opioid epidemic and all these mass shootings and all that stuff, which seems to me symptomatic of something. It's almost symptomatic of the sort of craziness and despair and hopelessness that people feel.
Yeah, sure.
Whereas if you can have the perspective that we're expressing here, that there is actually a mass awakening taking place, then you're not so depressed by the 6 o'clock news. You feel like, whoa, something actually good is happening. It's not making the news because it's too subtle, but there's really hope for the world.
Yeah, there is, but we shouldn't be too Pollyannish about it, and the enormous challenge of what we're facing, and also the degradation to so many communities that are, and peoples that are really so profoundly marginalized and unsupported, that these extreme events are happening.
Yeah. I'm sure you would agree that, you know, it's not sufficient just to sit on the cushion. But it's also not sufficient just to be the activist who doesn't sit on the cushion. I mean, the ideal blend is both. If there can be sort of, you know, an awakening of one's own consciousness and an expression of that in activity of some sort, you're going to be much more effective.
You said it, and you know that's true. And we continually find the balance. I mean, so many people who care, the carers and the activists, get burned out and overwhelmed by the monumental tasks at hand, and that's where the meditative skills of being able also to reflect in a moment. This is how it is. There's the sense of overwhelm. There's the nervous system misfiring. There's exhaustion. I'm so grateful to the Buddha's teaching, who reminded us that the sacred is always right at the heart of however it is here and now, and that it's not just when we get to the place where we think it should be. So in those moments of overwhelm, to have cultivated and still be cultivating that capacity to say, this is how it is now, and to receive the exhaustion and the sensations in the body of the nervous system freaking out a bit, and to hear the thoughts scrambling, and just to know them as they are, feelings and phenomenon coming and going, again within a spacious listening, within awareness that's not moving, and to know how to engage, but also know how to retreat. This skillful shuttling of how to resource ourselves, and when we do that, I can't find it in the scriptures, but it's like, I remember a story once that if a cow was stuck in the mud, you could jump in the mud to keep a cow company, but you might you know, just get hurt and you both go down. But you need a solid purchase, and then to make contact from a solid purchase to be able to pull this suffering creature out. So in moments, even when we're overwhelmed, if we come to the actuality of the sensations, the feelings, whatever's happening in being overwhelmed, that's the solid purchase. Our refuge, our abiding then is on the truth of the matter. And then we can recharge somewhat to then allow to respond from what is to how we maybe can do something.
Yeah. Well, in other words, if you don't know how to swim, don't try to get a job as a lifeguard. And in the Gita, Lord Krishna says, established in yoga, perform action. So first kind of get yourself grounded in being, or whatever you want to call it, and then on that foundation, action can be more effective and more appropriate, more right.
I think it's more responsive because you're learning to align with the innate intelligence of awareness, of the Buddho, you know, the knowing, this pure knowing awareness. It's dynamic, it's intelligent, and it's connected with the depth intelligence of the Dharma or reality. And then if you start to listen to that, then there's a certain guidance or responsiveness that's not just coming from the cognitive strategizing mind. You can use that in service of. So that's that, you know, without that, then I think our responses are very colored by our agendas, which are effective, but I don't think they really have the profound power of that transformative nature of what we're talking about and what's really needed to transform the consciousness in terms of how we respond, where we come from, what's needed. You know.
No, that's great. I guess another way of putting it is that, you know, there's a profound, vast, unbounded intelligence orchestrating the universe, and if we're estranged from that, isolated, cut off from that, then we're left to our own wits, you know, to sort of manage in life. But if we can become attuned to that, then that intelligence guides and governs our life.
I was very struck when I was at Standing Rock, how the whole indigenous community that was represented there, yeah, how they actually moved from that place, and how it was so ancient, from so ancestral, that their activism and their engagement in taking on, which was really quite extreme, aggressive forces, that it was very clear that they were completely trusting the power of ceremony and prayer and the spiritual and the sacred. And their trainings were around that, and the decolonization of the mind that's kind of constantly going into the sense of me fighting against them, the hierarchy of power, you know, to really explore that, how that suffuses everything how we think, what we're doing. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was very radical to be there. And I felt a great honor to be there as someone learning from an ancient peoples that hold this peace and held it so profoundly, and the way they moved and the way that they responded. But definitely that sense of that deep intelligence, being informed by that, it had a real sense of sacredness. It suffused.
Yeah, now some people might argue that, well, that was nice, but the pipeline got built. But yeah, what would you say to that?
Yeah, but it's not over. There's still court cases going on, but also it's not, they've been doing this for 500 years. The First Nation peoples, Indigenous peoples, they've learned a lot in terms of standing up to extreme power. It's not just, a little bit of power that we could overturn. This is the power that has committed genocide upon them and across the lands. And so they know what it is to be profoundly brutalized and disenfranchised. And they've also been extremely marginalized, but they've learned something that's really profound, and that was, for me, what was really important, is to honor that learning, and for them to recognize, yes, this isn't the end of this is a battle that wasn't, seemingly at first has been, I don't know if it's completely lost, because as I said, there's court cases going on, but it's not the end of the war, the longer struggle, so.
Yeah. Another thing is that
struggle. There were 2,000 vets.
Yeah, I saw a documentary.
It inspired. I think it inspired activists to come from this very radically different place. So that was what was so profound for me.
And the Occupy movement was sort of along those same lines. But just on this point, it's a little tangential, but I saw a documentary recently about how quickly solar and other alternative energies are moving along. And the guy was saying at the rate they're going, oil is not going to be viable much longer, below a certain price or above a certain price, and that pipeline and many other types of oil, the Canadian tar sands and the Bakken oil, is just going to get priced out of the market because
the money
even in Dubai they're going to solar, and they've got all the oil in the world that they're sitting on.
Yeah, I think the economics of it is going to be the main game changer, actually, because it often is. Yeah. And we are in this crunch of an energy revolution, which is sort of in a way reflective of the consciousness revolution. It's very exciting.
It is. Yeah, and I just want to come back to the point that, if we keep talking about this kind of thing, Standing Rock and energy revolutions and things like that, it's because those and the consciousness of the earth and the whole thing of awakening and enlightenment and all that many people watching this show are interested in are inextricably intertwined. It's like two legs of a stool. You pull one and the rest are going to come along. If there's really an awakening going on, then it's going to change these economic and social structures because those, again, are an expression of the collective consciousness.
Absolutely, and there's another way an ordinary person can contribute this machine that's chewing up the resources of the earth and crushing over the creatures and the peoples that stand in the way. It's built around this insatiable consuming of everything, and so when people are practicing, as we do in the contemplative world, learning to tune into the sheer joy of standing and relaxing, of breathing and aligning ourselves with this cosmic rhythm, and tuning up the awareness to notice the nature of form, and how that takes us back home to this deep place of belonging, because at our deepest place, we merge with that awareness that holds everything. When we learn how to take a holiday, to return in moments to a place of wholeness by appreciating breath and body and awareness, we're living in a way that is not exploiting anybody, chewing up unnecessarily resources in the earth. When we try to move our diets to more plant-based diets, that's another way we can contribute to turning the dial down on that rampant consumerism that keeps, feeding this chewing up of the resources of the earth.
Right.
And so I just don't want to forget that. I want to include that moments when we do that, and moments also when we, an important part of our work is when we come together collectively and have ceremonies together and grow beyond our individual personalities and invoke this power of unity and harmony. There's an energy that really is blessing and transformative that I think helped us, for example, survive 23 years in South Africa at a time that it was very turbulent and quite challenging. I would like to encourage us to realize we can balance the activist work, or honor the activist work, but also honor what we do, even in personal ways, when we learn how to, in Buddhism it's called cultivate samadhi. It's states of unity that aren't in a wholesome, pleasant abiding that's not dependent on chewing up any external resources, that's born of pausing, listening, welcoming. And that sort of skillful learning how to take a holiday, learning how to find joy in nature, joy in walking and sitting and awareness is on a wider level. When more people do that, has a big impact on a culture that maybe has this idea that what really makes us healthy is consuming more and more and more. And I was just saying that's another powerful way to address the crisis as we learn to need less, and as we, I was trying to make that.
That's good. I mean, around Christmas time every year, the news is all about the sales records and the people mobbing the stores and stampeding and fighting over the latest toy and stuff like that, and it just seems so crazy. I know that in our case, like, our car is like, I don't know, 16, 17 years old, and every now and then we think, should we get a newer car? But all we hardly ever do is drive around town, and the car does that just fine. So we figure, well, let's hang on to it. Maybe it'll last until really good electric cars come out that we can afford.
Which they are beginning to.
Yeah.
And I think the other, looking at Christmas, for example, it's like all of us in this awakening world. We could encourage a non-consumption Christmas. If people, as leaders and teachers, to look at that, do we really need to contribute to that? And I think the other point that Kittisaro made that might have been muffled in the sound difficulty was them shifting to more plant-based diets as a very profound contribution, as one of the leading causes of climate destabilization and eco-destruction. And also, besides what it does for us and what it does for us so we can survive on the planet, it's just decolonizing our mind from this idea that we have the right to control animals, or as the native expression is, our relatives. These are our relatives. We just can perceive them as animals and perceive them as low on the hierarchy. And so those kinds of mindsets that we don't have the right to do that. Really, now that we're so aware of what it involves in these huge agro farms, so this sort of awareness where everything that we're connected with, as you say, the car that you're driving, the flights we take. I mean, we're all contributing to this economy through the use of oil, and it can't be avoided. But I think the heightening of awareness begins to change our engagement and our activity. Is what mindfulness does. And you find yourself one day and you say, I can't do that like that anymore, let me find another way. And I think it's a gradual thing, but it needs to happen faster.
Yeah.
And I think it is actually.
It's picking up steam.
It's picking up speed, and you see these tipping points happening, like major fast food chains beginning to introduce vegan options into their hamburgers and so on, and these sort of beyond meat organizations and these investments in looking at dietary meat replacements and so on. So yeah,
things can change faster than people think. I mean, the Berlin Wall fell quite abruptly, and the Soviet Union collapsed quite abruptly, but also, when we think of tipping points, there's negative tipping points, of course, in terms of methane being released from the Arctic, but ordinary tipping points, like or phase transitions, they're sometimes called in physics, where like you have water at 99 degrees centigrade and nothing much seems to be happening. One more degree and it's turning to steam and boiling. So there could be phase transitions like that in society as well, that we might be closer to than we realize.
There's a lot unpredictable. There's a lot of wild cards out there.
Yeah, there are.
We don't know which way they'll tip, definitely. Yeah. Including in the political realm.
Yep.
You could tip into fascism.
Yeah, or tip into something a lot more enlightened.
Hopefully.
I want to totally shift gears and go back to your typhoid fever. And you're also talking about Mandela in jail for 27 years. And the fellow I interviewed from South Africa recently, John Lockley, talks about something called Thwaza or something in the Sangoma tradition, which is this sickness that people often get when they are marked to become a Sangoma, and a spiritual leader in that tradition. It's like kind of nature puts them through the ringer in terms of something they've got to work out. And there are stories in Christian tradition like that too. St. Francis got very sick before undergoing the transition he did, and there are many other examples. So is there something like that in the Buddhist tradition that's commonly known? Yeah? Absolutely, and
it wasn't what my sense of self wanted, my aspirations.
Right.
But when as I told you, I was quite a willful person, used to being able just to shift things through force of will. But then when I hit typhoid fever after 6 months of diarrhea, and then got bit by a centipede, then was urinating blood, and got weaker, but I was still pushing. But then the typhoid fever knocked me down, and then my whole body was different for years. It ulcerates all your insides, and I was really, really exhausted and had to pretty much lie down for 3 years, and was quite ill for 10. But there's a principle in Buddhism called Devadutta, which is called heavenly messenger, and that in the Buddha's own life, it was these encountering things that his first reaction was to turn away from and recoil, because he didn't want to really look at and be with old age, sickness, and death. But he caught himself and thought, what am I? He talked like, the vanity left me when I realized, but this body has the nature to age and sicken and die. So what am I reacting to? And how it's a heavenly messenger, at the time I didn't know, but when I couldn't shift it, I could have just quit and blamed everybody. But when my teachers and the Buddha talks about, no, there's something important here. Surrender to this, receive a teaching here, and then this first noble truth, this ennobling truth of dukkha. It's not a static thing. The Buddha said when there is that which is hard to bear, like sickness, he didn't say it needs to be conquered. He said it needs to be opened to. And then when one opens to it, just on the first level, one deepens one's capacity to be real, to be realistic. And in opening to it, there's then a possibility of seeing how we keep feeding it and perpetuating it. So this insight into how suffering is continued by wanting things to be different, and that somehow when there is that opening to that, and in moments of questioning, what happens if I just let something be? What if I'm able, let go of just clinging to the idea of how it should be, and clinging to this aversion, this shouldn't be, this pain, it's not fair, I've done all this work, I've come all this way. If we somehow let them be, and then those moods just become what they are, those feelings, we touch into this sacred ground, this ever-present background awareness within which all manifests and dissolves. And that is a profound shifting of lineage. What we used to think was me, my worries, my poor sickness, we realize that's true, but only as ephemeral sensations. We drop into this deeper abiding. So that's and this truth of the rebirth, in a sense, not being reborn out in another body, but renewal is the same principle in the cross and resurrection. You know, by opening to the suffering, there's a possibility of the deep transformation. Similarly, in this noble truth of suffering, and in my case, this opening to a sickness, it's later became really important, because when I couldn't do any of the monastic routines, I had to lie down all that time, and the internal bleeding, and I had a lot of chronic inflammation and was very weak. But lying down meditation is a wonderful thing. On each out breath, I would let go of trying to get anywhere and just feel the support of the ground. And when similarly, when one softens volition of trying to change things, one can recognize that part of being itself, which just is.
Yeah.
And so I had a chance really to deepen in that, which I'm grateful that the illness gave me an opportunity.
Yeah, I know a fellow who wrote a book called Blessed by a Brain Tumor. He felt he learned a lot from it. Here's a couple sentences from your book which pertain to this. He said, the Buddha realized that actually life is unfolding perfectly according to its own natural laws. At its core, it is peaceful and luminous. Habitually wanting this moment to be other than it is, however, causes distress, and we lose sight of our true nature. And then a little bit later on, suffering is something that is generated from the mind's inability to accept reality.
Yeah.
Kind of sounds like Byron Katie, if you're familiar with her. Yeah.
Well, that's the Four Noble Truths at the heart of the Buddha's teaching. So profound. Sometimes it's like, oh yeah, I've got that. What's the real profound stuff? But to realize that a lot of the dukkha, the suffering that is, there's pain and difficulty that comes to us, but what we do with it is the reactivity around that is generated from the mind itself, and that we can solve. So once we get that piece, and as a practice, and then feel the fruit of that, it's a direct doorway into the unconditioned, into the unborn and the unoriginated. So that nexus of dukkha being a gateway is a very different relationship to that experience than dukkha is something we distract ourselves from, and we go shopping, we have our addictive tendencies. So it's a very profound learning, and it's almost a learning that can only come about sometimes when we're stuck and we can make no other move than to let go, which is what a monastic life will do. It will push you in the corner, or a deadly sickness. And then, of course, when that letting go, then all sorts of mysterious unfoldings and shifts of consciousness start to happen.
And ironically, the letting go sometimes makes a healing much more possible, because one's limited sense of how it should be and all that pushing and pulling and contraction really messes up our subtle energy channels, because we think we're separate, but just even on the level of breath, we realize this ocean of vitality that we can breathe in and breathe what we breathe in, the trees breathe out, and what we breathe out, the trees breathe in. And that's just breath, not even to mention these subtle connections through consciousness. We're hooked up to this whole undivided mystery. And when one is wrestling with the will, doing all this stuff, that constricts the channels that feed us. And when my teacher, my Western teacher, who remembered me when I used to teach the monks yoga, I was so active, and so he wanted me to get well. And one day when he came up to my room when I was in this attic for a long time, where out of the way of the monastery was a bit of a building site, because we were repairing this old Victorian house. The abbot said, Kittisaro, I realize I've been putting all this pressure on you to get well, because we wanted you back to how you used to be. And he said, I give you permission to die. And he said, it's not we want you to die,
right.
But, and the relief, the relief of joy, and in more profoundly surrendering to a situation, sometimes the very mysterious energy that can help transform that then is allowed to flow. And I didn't die. And little by little, my energy returned. Mm-hmm. And so I think even though we're so convinced it shouldn't be this way, and sometimes we feel guilty as an activist, oh, does it mean I just don't care if I'm letting go for a moment of this horror at what people are doing or what has happened? I think we should trust that in those moments of softening and letting go, we're touching down into a deeper reservoir that can also refresh a situation. And so I would really encourage activists, and we do that just to survive, to learn to modulate, being on the front lines, to pausing and feeling into the perfection of a moment, even when it's painful.
Sure. Well, as you know, I mean, we'd die within seconds if we had to consciously, willfully orchestrate and control all the functions in our body. I mean, we'd just be gone in a moment. And but there are more functions, such as behavior and thought and all kinds of things that actually can also be put in the lap of God, as it were, and managed much more skillfully than our puny intelligence can manage, if we're willing to let go. And well, there's the bumper sticker, let go and let God.
That's nice.
Yeah. An interesting question came in from Faisal al-Sarhi from Lebanon. He asks, he says, around 2 months ago, I participated in a Vipassana retreat as taught by Escoenka. I would say that was a very dry, patriarchal approach. I did not resonate with it at all. And it is said that the Theravada tradition has rarely produced any realized being in the last 1,000 years, unlike Mahayana tradition, which is rich and layered. Can you comment on this? And before you do, I just wanted to read a quote from Thanissara's book. She said, when monasticism and spiritual practice are overly shaped by a warrior strategy, mostly focused on overcoming the pull of the world, they tend to offer only a partial ripening, one that eventually undermines a fuller and more integrated awakening. The times we are now in invite a shift from a transcendent metaphor, which holds us to a lonely road, where we throw away the world like an old rag, to an integrative vision, where awakening is collective and radiates into all spheres of life with a blessed healing touch. For this, the powerful, dedicated, and loyal warrior is invited to enter the path of love.
Wow, I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you for the question. We both began our journeys with a Vipassana style. It was called Vipassana, as taught by Goenkaji. And I moved on from that partly because I did find it became rigid. I think inwardly and outwardly for me, not for everyone else. A very powerful technique. It was originally taught by Lady Sayadaw as a Burmese forest master. That methodology of taking attention through the body, but it was taught as a healing method, actually physical healing method. And that's, if you remember the story of Goenka, he went to get healing for his migraines. So it is a very powerful method, but it's also it's not very integrated at all, I would say. That's the problem I found, that you leave the meditation retreat, there's no integration. So the way of awakening, we're not really here to just become a good meditator or a good Buddhist. We're here to awaken, and these are methods, these are pathways, and there's many pathways offered. And through the Mahayana, through the Theravada, I think it's hard to, like when Ajahn Chah was asked, are you enlightened, are you awakened? And he said, well, it actually takes one to know one. He would never speculate on that. I would refute the idea that there's no awakened Theravada masters. I think we've seen some very contemporary ones in the forest school, and in also many schools, many different ways. It depends how we define that too. And that's a whole discussion.
How we define awaken, you mean?
Yeah, or how we define enlightenment masters, and so on.
We might want to touch on that as we go along.
Yeah, but. So in my journey, I found it wasn't only Buddhist meditation, which is core in Buddhist teaching, but also doing psychotherapeutic work, doing body work, doing somatic healing work, doing shamanic work, different kinds of work to supplement so that there's more integrated and fullness of embodied awakening. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a sort of transcendent that abdicates from the emotional plane, from the embodied plane, from the relational field. So my point in the book was that actually a lot of Theravada, and you find it very strongly in the Mahayana too, is the Buddhist metaphor is very much steeped in the warrior mode. You sort of, the tremendous effort it takes for awakening. But when you find that a Buddha's life, he used that, in the archetypal journey of his life, when he was trying to crush the body, not breathe, refuse to eat food, and he got to the point of near death. And then appears the young, compassionate maiden, Sujata, who comes with milk rice and offers him nourishment. And at that point, he realizes he needs nourishment, but it's really a metaphor for him opening to the depth feminine, to the world of form, and realizing that the way of awakening isn't crushing form in the material realm. It's actually opening to it and realizing reality is suffused through the world of form. It's not pulled out of that world of form. So then he was able, through that path, through that way of opening, to then realize his full awakening. And so I call it the shift from the warrior mode, as you read, to the lover archetype, which is a necessary part of re-coming into the marketplace, not just trying to get out of samsara, but re-entering the marketplace with this recognition that the completion of the journey is to be with love, within our embodied experience, within our relational experience, and that's a whole other piece of work and contemplation.
Yeah, it kind of relates to this theme that we keep coming back to, which is surrendering to divine intelligence, if you want to call it that, rather than sort of trying to pound away through individual will, and which in a sense can kind of accentuate and reify the ego, it would seem to me.
And it's not, I think, one or the other. To me, as we develop maturity and agility and tuning in our practice, it's not a question of surrender or will or warrior or love. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's learning how to, that capacity to persevere and to focus and to inquire, to really look into a situation is very important. But if that's the only, gear that we know, we can sometimes burn out. And, that famous saying of Nisargadatta, the great non-dual sage, he said, wisdom says I'm nothing. Compassion says I'm everything. And between these two banks, the life of the awakened one flows. Yeah. And so I think we can learn when to go narrow, when to look into and see the nature, but then also how to keep softening, relaxing, surrendering, welcoming, and checking again how it all comes together, how it heals. And that that dance between the two, I think, is as our, we're still learning, but I think we get more adept at how to intuitively know what is appropriate. Sometimes it's really incredible to be able to persevere in emergency and have that energy. But then, if that's all we know, that can be so insensitive sometimes. Sometimes we just need to be able to soften and welcome. And finally, to answer that questioner, the Vipassana expression of those Goenka retreats is quite a narrow picture of all of Theravada practice. There's also a lot of devotion in certainly some of the, like in our monastery of Ajahn Chah, where you do lots of chanting and bowing, where you're also regularly practicing surrendering and melting into that central place where everything merges.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say on this point that you were just making about softening and surrendering, it seems like, you're saying it's not like you have to be able to, not only that you have to be able to do both, but you have to be able to do both simultaneously. And, here's a nice quote from one of your books. When we authentically align with that deeper prompting, there was a response. This is a living and responsive universe. Signs will come, books or people, or an event we feel drawn to attend. The important thing, especially with the lover energy, is to stay open, inwardly soft and receptive. So, and I think you can do that in the midst of a very determined, dynamic, purposeful type of activity. Because if you don't do that, then that activity can become brutish. You can just become sort of insensitive, as you were saying, and kind of forge ahead in a wrong direction. But if you can sort of be, applying yourself at the same time sensitive to feedback from the universe, to indicators that, well, maybe you better go a little bit this way, then it can be more successful.
Exactly. Well put.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Let's keep talking about this theme. This is good. Interesting. Here's a point. Well, let's comment on this one, and then I'll go to the next one. You say when we open to the eros energy of life, which I think is what we're talking about here, the divine feminine, the softer quality, what is initially intoxicating has then to be matured into a global and less personally focused compassion. What do you mean by that?
Yes, that it was written in a context of a whole piece, and I can't remember the whole piece that it was written in. But the eros energy is to do with our life force, our sexuality, our creativity, the imaginative, the intuitive, and often that doesn't get held or named very well in the Buddhist lexicon of warrior type approaches. And I would connect that with the depth feminine and the sort of deeply embodied in life, instead of that sense of being a bit afraid of life. You sometimes get that feeling that in Buddhist practice it's a bit like, don't tempt me with anything. And I think because it is close to sexuality, and that's because Buddhism has come through monastic celibate traditions for centuries. That is a very kind of complex area. It's not a very, and because of our own sexual conditioning around our own sexuality in our contemporary society, with this in Judeo-Christianity, was profound shaming. I was just reading an article, having, my family coming from Ireland, and I was just reading an article about the legacy of pregnancies outside of marriages in that culture, and the terrible shaming and death that happened of children born out of wedlock.
Yeah, there was a great movie about that a couple of years ago. I don't know if you saw it. I forget.
The Madeline sisters, which is chilling. And so, this is a we have these very neurotic and distorted relationships, or the selling of sex out there to sell a product, or women's bodies, or So all of this has led to this this distorted relationship to this fundamental eros energy, which is actually needed for our life force, and it's needed for us to feel embodied and part of part of this web of life, part of the fecundity of the earth. And so we've morphed into this abstraction. We live as a sort of abstracted species in realms of technology and the rational, and divorced again from that energy. So at first when we feel that, it's often when we feel in love. We fall in love, and then we feel, or we sexually aroused, or that whole love, sex, intimacy nexus. And that's very personal, and it's about me and the other. But when I was talking about it maturing, is that we start with that. But in the spiritual practice, and in the healthy monastic practice, that is the ideal, is that energy is transmuted and transformed and brought into the heart center, and then it becomes available. And you see like a Dalai Lama emerge, or you see like our teacher Ajahn Chah, where that love energy was available for everyone, regardless.
I see.
And then it becomes a huge umbrella or huge tree, as Ajahn Chah described himself as a huge tree which all sorts of birds can sit in, or a huge umbrella that shades and helps people like a Mandela, so that you see the merging of the warrior, king, lover archetype that completely is able to transmute that eros love energy. For the welfare of, as the bodhicitta, bodhisattva, the welfare of the whole.
Which kind of, in a way, Mandela was a monk, since he lived in prison for 27 years.
I guess he was.
Didn't stay with his wife very long after he left. Yeah. And then, of course, the Ajahn Chah and others, and the Dalai Lama are monks. But what you're saying is that, the energy that they might, or correct me if you're not saying this, that the energy they might have expended or used in a more personal relationship, or even a sexual relationship, was somehow sublimated or transmuted, to use the word you just used, and ended up causing their hearts to blossom into a much more universal, all-embracing way of functioning than it might have been had they just been family men.
Yeah, but I don't want to denigrate family people that also working on this path and able to use the family as a container, as their monastery, as their means of developing that energy. Because then we can get into this. But it is the case that's a journey. I think whatever container we're in, whether we're a family, monastery, or otherwise, that's a necessary journey that we make in awakening. That we start to shift out of our personal fixations and are able to then open out as we mature into this more collective.
And to start reflecting whatever our circumstance, whether in a monastery or in the world, in a sexual relationship or not, that we can start to inquire into this energy that where we see beauty, where we feel like we want intimacy, but start to recollect the kinship that we have with all beings, that we all share this old age and sickness and death and disappointment and hope, and that and especially as we start to contemplate and realize this sense of separation is rooted in the way that we think and how we relate to our thoughts, and we start to touch into that abiding, where everyone as they're appearing in our mind keeps dissolving back into this silent, ever-present listening. Then we can start to touch into and practice and cultivate an intimacy, a well-wishing that is universal. It doesn't deny the special relationships that we have, but it doesn't limit our concern, our compassion, our sense of closeness just to those beings. And so, all the great religious and spiritual traditions have encouraged this purification of love to a more universal blessing quality.
Good point. My wife and I also lived in a monastic lifestyle for 15 years prior to getting married, and as you can probably attest, very often people living in those circumstances are among the most sort of self-centered and idiosyncratic people you're likely to meet. It's all about me, and my enlightenment and my routine and my comfort and my quietness and all this stuff. And when you actually enter into a relationship with another person, you have to you have to start thinking about the other person or it's not going to work. And if you have kids, then you're expanding your territory even further, and then it might expand to the community, and then maybe to the nation, maybe to the world. So being in the world is not necessarily limiting in terms of one's. In fact, it may be conducive to a more universal perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah, monastics are an eccentric bunch. I agree with that.
Yeah, you can. I've seen it in various contexts. I mean, visiting a Christian monastery one time, the organization I was working for was thinking of buying. There's some really kooky characters hanging around there that maybe they didn't make it very well in society, and that's why they ended up there. I think that may be part of it. But also, I think the lifestyle can make you even more kooky because it doesn't necessarily give you the feedback you need, which you might get in a more, and if you start like not getting along with somebody, you can always gravitate to somebody else. But if you're married or in a relationship that you're just in day and night, then you really kind of have to work out your stuff.
Yeah, it's an imperfect container. What I appreciated about it is it enabled depth. Yeah. But it didn't actually have sometimes sophistication in regards to the relational field or psycho understanding of psychology.
Yeah.
And psycho-spiritual bypassing in that territory. So
it's also interesting to consider how so many of the leaders or gurus of these, who very often coming from the East, kind of fall flat in their faces after a while in the West because they just haven't had the social interaction experience in their spiritual upbringing that they kind of needed to have in order to function in Western society.
Yeah, that's a big subject. That's definitely that. Yeah, and I think the patriarchal structures that the transmission has happened, through which the transmission has happened of the Dharma, of awakening modalities, also contributes to a difficulty around a more natural, organic process of feedback and checking. And maybe those very same gurus in their own home systems had more containment and feedback processes that weren't available in the West, or the way Westerners, the lack of boundaries and the way Westerners misunderstood perhaps some of their cultural, the way they would have been held in a cultural context.
Yeah.
But also this sense of the divine right of the guru is something that we don't understand very well, and has become very unhealthy and distorting and abusive. So there's a lot of fallout, a lot of learning around all of this, definitely, the last few decades.
Yeah, I mean, the divine right of gurus works about as well as the divine right of kings. I mean, you really have to earn it, and very often they haven't, and yet they claim it. And people follow them blindly, thinking, well, I don't understand this behavior, but this guy is supposed to be enlightened, so I guess I'm just going to go along with it.
Exactly.
And then the whole thing just gets more and more off the deep end.
Exactly. I mean, in the Buddha, the original structure, the Karma Vinaya, this Karma Sangha, that which Sangha Karma, that which guides the development of community, there was always within that the system of called Pravarna, invitation for feedback, which was also a ceremony that you were supposed to go through collectively every year. But it means that whoever you are, whether you're an abbot, whether you're the head of the monastery, whether you're the newest member, that you open yourself for feedback. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the system of checks and balances and health, if it's very authentic. But it tends to become rather stylized and formalized, and so the actual real ability to do that in a process-oriented way is not always that available. But I think that's what keeps those systems healthy.
And I really feel that I hope those systems remain, because to me the option in a society of a place where one can lead a celibate, renunciate life and focus with other kindred spirits is very important. But I would like to, also the Buddha talked about a fourfold Sangha and the importance of not only ordained men and women, but also lay men and lay women, and how the two can support one another. So I would hate to see those deep monastic contemplative opportunities disappear. Certainly they had a huge blessing on our life, but I think we it is not the only way. And however we're practicing, there can be shadows. And just as Thanissara said, the Buddha realized that and encouraged us to keep being aware that we might have blind spots. That's why he encouraged us to not be the kind of people that you can't give feedback to, but to be the kind of person who is interested in, how's this impacting you? Is there something I need to hear back from you?
Yeah. A week ago today, I gave a talk at the Science and Non-Duality Conference about the ethics of enlightenment. Not that I'm supposed to be some kind of expert on this, but I just put together a lot of thoughts and conferred with a bunch of friends and gave this talk, which I'll be posting on Batgap. But part of the talk was a quote that I read from the Dalai Lama, where he talks about, if a teacher is behaving inappropriately, you really need to call him on it. And if he doesn't respond, then publish it in the newspaper, include his name. We shouldn't just sweep this stuff under the rug and hope that things are going to be okay.
I think the difficulty with that advice, I think it's a very, very good advice, but a lot of people that are sometimes abused are quite disempowered, and there can be fear, and very real concerns about, if you've been in a community for a few decades and you've got no other livelihood. So they're often not in a very powerful position to do that. So really, yes, that should happen, but really it should be the leaders of the community that should also hold each other accountable.
Yeah.
Because they have the power, they hold the power.
Something like that's happening in Hollywood now with this whole Harvey Weinstein scandal, and all these actresses and women who had been abused by him are speaking out finally, and they had been afraid to do so for fear of losing their jobs because he was so powerful in Hollywood. But now Hollywood itself, the upper echelon, is saying, this is the end of an era. We're not going to tolerate this anymore. So it seems like on several different fronts like that, there's a transparency that's suddenly emerging and a sort of a dissatisfaction with the status quo or this kind of old hanky-panky going on any longer,
Yeah, I think that if you've spent millennia objectifying, the guy, one of my friends was talking about this the other day, that from South Africa, Peter Woods, who's a former minister, talking about how the whole system produces the guy at the top. He's the powerful guy, and you have in the system with the objectification of women. Then it's your right, like the king again. It's your right to pick and choose, and you get away with this behaviour. But it's just so it is the characters that display the behaviour, but it's a systemic level that we also need to look at. And I think the Me Too campaign that went out and went viral in response to Weinstein was very powerful, because it really broke the silence. The thing of those that feel victimized, breaking the silence, women or peoples that have been abused in various spheres of society, whether through gender or what other reason, that they're in a marginal, disempowered position, to break the silence collectively so that it reveals and opens the shadow. And then, as you say, this sort of another tipping point, it's like this toxic behavior is no longer acceptable. It's not something that we're going to withstand.
And these things really are breakthroughs. I think progress is being made, and we're not just going to, once a certain norm has been established, like gay marriage, for instance, it's not going to be made illegal again, because it's just something has been established. And this whole thing about abusing women and so on, it's a lot of this stuff. It's a time for things to come to light. I guess that's what I want to say. That a lot of stuff that's been hidden is coming to light now. And
huge amounts.
Yeah, that's very inspiring, or
it has to.
Yeah.
I think that's part of our evolutionary crunch at the moment, is that we're being faced with systemic levels of these profoundly dysfunctional systems.
And I think something that helps us in the, which is a warning, the Buddha gave an image. He said, if you're riding on the back of a donkey and fall off, no big deal, you just dust yourself off. It might be a little more painful, but he said if you're riding on the back of an elephant and you fall off, you can break your back.
Right.
He's saying that when you're in this position of leadership, carrying a banner of a monk, a nun, a guru, a leader of something, the megaphone of your power increases the karma so much that it's just really important to remember that, what you do that is good can be amplified, but what you do that is unwholesome, rooted in selfishness and aversion or just insensitive greed and lust is amplified exponentially.
Yeah.
And so our teacher, Ajahn Chah, kept saying, he told us all, we're all going to be teachers. He said, it'll happen. He said, but don't be the kind of teacher that gets so puffed up you can't get through the door. He said, fundamentally, you're a practitioner. And if it's time for some sharing to happen, or teaching, or leadership, okay, one does that. But that's not who one is. That's not one's identity. One's prime identity is this humble, taking refuge again and again with this inner place of listening and awareness. And I found that advice really is helping me to try to stay sane.
Yeah. It says it's always good to have the attitude of a beginner.
Yeah, good.
And just what you were saying there, Kittisaro, I mean, there's so many examples of these sort of larger than life, out of control characters who are just sort of, you know, I don't know, it's like you said, the bigger they are, the harder they fall or something. But I remember there's some quote from, who is it, Padmasambhava, I believe. He said, even though my awareness is as vast as the sky, my attention to karma is as fine as a grain of barley flour.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. So it's almost like the more vast your awareness becomes, the more impeccable you need to be.
Perfect.
Yeah. Or one way of putting it is, if a judge commits the same crime as a uneducated, man, perhaps his punishment will be greater because he really should know better. He knows the law, you know.
Yeah, so more responsibility, the more aware you become, definitely.
Yeah. Right. Interesting point. Though keep in mind as we go along that if I'm not asking some question and you have something in mind you want to talk about that's different than what we're talking about, just let me know. But here's something. I don't know. I just took all these notes down. I don't know whose book is whose at this point, but one of you said, for the most part, the practice of Buddhist meditation introduced into Western culture from the late 1960s went hand in hand with spiritual bypassing. And I wouldn't necessarily just pin it on Buddhist meditation. I think maybe the same was true of meditations coming out of Hindu traditions. So do you suppose, is that because of what we've been talking about, do you think, the patriarchal emphasis, or is there some other reason for that, or what?
I think there's, I think it's quite complex why we want to bypass the actual journey of awakening and the messy side of it. I think we often get into these systems commit at very deep levels. You talked about you being a monastic, we were a monastic, or people going into a spiritual path. And then it's very easy to start to generate an idealized persona and an ideation of what enlightenment and spirituality is, which is completely problematic. We can land up being a rather aloof, judgmental person that feels above everyone and really not looking at our own inner issues or our own shadows, our own wounds. We prefer not to go there. And so what can actually happen is as we split away from very fundamental wounding, and we're not really addressing that deep areas of, rage or unacceptable emotions, rage, jealousy, pettiness, resentment. These aren't very nice energies to admit that we have. It doesn't fit our spiritual persona. But the danger in that is that, one, that we repress them and it can actually affect the body in very negative ways because that energy is still there, or we project them onto the self and we get the affect of feeling depressed or feeling dislocated. Then we project them onto other people, like why you're the ones that are angry and petty, not me. So this term, I think it was coined a little bit by John Wilwood's work, which is really worth reading. The Psychology of Awakening is one of his primary books. Is returning. This is why I did a lot of in-depth therapeutic work. So I realized I'd bypassed quite a lot, and I realized that I had these sort of, you can feel it in your energy body. You have these dislocations and splits within, and then there's sort of symptoms of that. So going through a very deep awareness-based psychotherapeutic process enabled me, and it continues to enable me, to get in touch with very early, what we call primary patterning, very early patterning when the developmental phases of your life, when a lot of these very deep, we might categorize as negative energies, or the bad sense of self is developed through painful experience, and it gets kind of locked into your energy body, and then it gets layers over through all sorts of defenses, which dislocates us and doesn't allow the fullness of our energy to operate. So actually returning into and opening into primary rage, for example, or primary fear, these kinds of energies, in a therapeutic relationship with a safely held, compassionate dynamic, enables a sort of release and opening and an understanding and an integration and a transformation of those energies, so that the awakening becomes more integrated emotionally and more embodied. And then there isn't these side effects and these splits that start to happen, where you can actually find, I think it leads into this very discussion we've just had, very awakened gurus on one level that can really talk the talk, but in another level they land up abusing people, or they land up in fits of rage and call it sort of crazy wisdom, when actually they're just enraged, and they've never dealt with the fact that perhaps they have a lot of anger, all of us don't start off as Buddhist gurus, we start off as young babies, and we develop these very deeply learned emotional experiences that it doesn't necessarily even come with abusive or bad parenting, even very small things, like not being fed on time and feeling abandoned and feeling lost, and these emotional learnings are very deep, and we compensate. So I like the term, just to wrap this up, because it's a big subject, but I like the way Ajahn Chah spoke about awakening. He said it's not that we're here to catapult ourselves into an ideal. Don't be a Buddha, don't be a Bodhisattva. He said, if you've got to be anything, be an earthworm, because at least they go down through the mud. So rather than a sort of up and out kind of metaphor, which fits this more disembodied patriarchal religious metaphor that's been going on for millennia, is like a down and through the material of our life. And it gets kind of muddy and messy, but it's more authentic, and then it allows us to really be more integrated and more whole.
Yeah, a lot of people coming around to that perspective, also in the sort of Vedanta non-dual world, because the other thing didn't work that well. So,
well, we learn it in the end.
Yeah, by necessity, they're coming around to that perspective. Here's a nice sentence from your book. You said, one of the functions of an emotion such as sadness is to keep our heart tender and open. It helps us feel what we need to feel to stay humane. And my friend Michael Rodriguez recently wrote an article called The Wisdom of Heartbreak. But in any case, it's just sort of a commentary on what you were just saying. Do you think that spiritual practice, at least as you have known it, can actually help a person keep things bottled up?
Definitely.
Even though they're trying to sort of open up to something deeper and vaster, it actually sort of keeps them numbed in certain ways. Yeah. I
think the early transmission of these enlightenment processes that came from Asia, I don't think there was a lot of psychological sophistication in terms of the individuated ego self. There's a very brilliant psychology of Buddhism, but in terms of the particularity of the developmental processes that you find really unfolded in very well in developmental therapeutic psychologists. I think that to marry in some of that wisdom is very, very helpful, both as wisdom but also as practice.
And I would like to add that I think it really helps to have a good teacher who is aware of this tendency, because if you're really aspiring to calm and tranquility and insight, and even the name of hindrance for desire and aversion, you can concretize those emotions as bad things that you need to get rid of. Our teacher Ajahn Chah said, don't be in a hurry to get rid of these things. He said they will be your teachers and your sharpening stones. So this active encouragement to also welcome from time to time these energies fully, to feel them, to relax with them, to get to know them. And as he said, read the book of your heart is the most important, rather than we have all these ideas about what the stages should look like, and then we try to project ourselves into some advanced stage, and we're not reading the moment-to-moment moods and tendencies, which are really revealing how it is right now. So I think a good teacher can help us a lot avoid some of those problems, and I think that's why spiritual friendship is vital, that to help us see our blind spots. Sometimes we get stuck, and it really takes a trustworthy person sometimes to help us see, hey man, what are you doing? You're just bottling it all up and laying it on me or them. Yeah. And sometimes that's why congregation or church or sangha or kindred spirits is considered so important, at least in the Buddhist path, to help us stay on track.
Yeah. I guess that if we wanted to put into a phrase everything we've been talking about here, or a lot of what we've been talking about here, it would be sacred feminine, which is kind of a popular phrase these days. Everybody's talking about it. And here's a quote from your book. You said, "It is also my understanding that it was not possible for the Buddha or anyone else to open into enlightenment without going through the door of the sacred feminine." So if we take that literally, the Buddha or anyone else, it almost sounds like anybody who hasn't done that, anybody who's still on the sort of hyper-masculine warrior path, so to speak, by definition, couldn't be enlightened yet. And they're going to have to soften and go through the door of the sacred feminine in order to be enlightened. Would you agree with that?
Well, that might be I don't know.
Too absolute.
That might be a bit too. Yeah.
Well, to me,
too grandiose.
Willpower, volition, when you're directing the attention to an object, to you, to this situation, then what appears in one's vision, whether it's a sensation, whether it's the cosmos, whether it's a state of peace, is going to be something that is by nature shifting, transmuting, and changing. Mm-hmm. And if that, when we only know willpower, that's the part that can claim, and then what we take to be me and mine keeps changing, so we create birth and death. Mm-hmm. So that energy is useful for persistence and investigation, but the Buddha said, absolutely, without, the word he used is patim nisaga, which means without giving it back, without that surrender and softening. Then we're only with that which is generated through volition. Without that, and a phrase for it is the sacred feminine, the dying into and surrendering to the ultimate womb, the ultimate receptacle, which is that ground of awareness. The Buddha said there's no freedom unless there's that. So the two really, I would agree, the name of it we can discuss and come up with different names, but there needs to be this training of volition and then relinquishing of it. Yeah. Training of it, relinquishing of it, which you can call the balance of male and female, or yin and yang.
Yeah, I think in that way that's beautifully put. And I think in that way we're looking at feminine not as a gender base. Quite obviously it is gender based, but also as an attribute within all gender or non-gender, those outside of the gender binary. It's an attribute of that profound receptivity, and therefore I probably would say, although I don't know, I'm qualifying that, but probably would say that has to be a doorway to full awakening, as it was for the Buddha, in my reading of the archetypal journey that he undertook.
Yeah, my understanding of his story, which I most recently read in your book, he was volitional and willful and persevering, to the nth degree, outdid everybody. But then his realization finally came only when he shifted into a more surrendered mode and accepted the food from the woman and, just kind of chilled a bit.
well, that's right, and also accepted life.
Yeah.
Accepted the body, and also he had the memory of the child. Right. So it was an intuitive. It's like the psyche. Well, through the moment you realize you can't do it, and then you gave up, and then these things happened, and then this very innocent, young opening through his memory of being a child and having an opening, and that led him then on the right track to his night of awakening.
Yeah.
And those are quite significant, a child and a woman, being sort of doorways.
Yeah.
For that softening and opening.
Turning points, and signposts reminding him you've gone to an extreme. Mm-hmm. You're heading in the wrong direction, and each of those turned him back to a place more of unification.
Yeah, I mean, his whole thing was the middle way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so what you were just saying, Kittisaro, a minute ago is, we don't want to be like surrendered to the point of no initiative or intention, or just said, I think I'll just lie on the couch and wait for something to happen. But on the other hand, if there's this sort of like straining, forcing, pushing, driving kind of energy relentlessly, then that too is imbalanced. So there's some kind of a both and paradoxical embrace of both qualities that is most effective.
Absolutely, well said.
Yeah. Well, it's getting a little.
To me,
sorry. Go ahead.
That's how our practice matures. It's ongoing. This agility, this tuning. There was a famous story of someone was very inspired at the time of the Buddha by the Buddha's life. He was wealthy. He gave up his inheritance to follow the Buddha, and he wanted to be awakened just like the Buddha, and he walked meditation back and forth, and more effort, even to the point of his feet starting to bleed. And then he just started thinking, well, I don't think I can do it. Maybe I can go back and be a lay person and do good deeds, and then in my next life I can be enlightened. And the Buddha overheard his thoughts from a distance and appeared before him and said, the guy's name was Sona. He said, Sona, so you're thinking of giving up? And he said, yes, no one can try harder than this. I can't do it. I was thinking of making good karma in next life. And the Buddha said, didn't you used to play a musical instrument? And Sona said, yeah. He played a stringed instrument called a vina. It seems to be something like a lute or something.
Yeah.
And the Buddha said, how was it when the string was too tight? And he said, did it make a nice sound? It screeched.
Yeah.
And he said, what about when it's too loose? He said, what if when you tune it just right? And so he was encouraging Sona and all of us that as our practice deepens, we learn to tune this volition and softening and surrendering, so that there's a balance that can be attuned to each situation.
Yeah.
We learn how to through listening in.
Yeah, it says that in the Vedic tradition too. The Gita, balance of mind is called yoga, and it says this yoga is not for him who eats too much or too little, who sleeps too much or too little, and just sort of this moderation advice. Okay, we're just about going to wrap it up, but one more thing I found interesting in your book, which I hadn't known, what others might wish to know, is that the Buddha himself didn't just sit under a tree with a beatific smile on his face. I mean, he was actually engaged in all kinds of things and all kinds of negotiations to try to stop a war and all sorts of interactions with all kinds of people. He lived a very active, engaged life with people of all types in the world.
Yes, and I think that's often doesn't get the precedent he set as someone that was talking with generals, with kings, with courtesans, with paupers, with lepers. That this whole range that actually affected a profound systemic change by ordaining women, by dissolving the hierarchy of caste in his ordination structures. That these sorts of by taking on animal sacrifices and denouncing them, that he was pretty
an activist,
powerfully effective in the society.
Yeah.
In the moment when he tried to stop a tribal war against one tribe against his own peoples, and then in the end he couldn't actually. He tried, he couldn't, and that was interesting too. That it wasn't that he was always successful. And there's great sadness that he had, that his peoples got wiped out, and Taparastu. So you get this picture of a very human, an awakened person that's interacting in a very human and relational field. And those examples don't really, you get this idea of a stone Buddha,
right.
and then not really how he was a flesh and blood person interacting, and how some of the teachings he did went well and some of them didn't go so well, and some of the disciples didn't get the message and then they did crazy things, and how people were trying to kill him and how people were constantly putting him down and arguing with him, but how he met all of these circumstances.
Yeah.
So it's a much more fully and blooded Buddha kind of sense of an embodied person.
Yeah, more realistic.
And this is a good template for us, I think. Not just enlightenment sitting on as a stone, immovable person, but actually engaged, getting things wrong, failing, considering, readjusting, starting again, but kind of impacting as well and looking at systemic levels, not just as personal awakening.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of what we were talking about earlier, people not being an activist without the inner attainment and not just focusing on the inner attainment to the exclusion of outer engagement. Exactly. And Buddha was an example of that, which I hadn't known before reading your book. Yeah. All right, well, I know you're in the middle of a retreat and you've got a very tight schedule, so we should probably wrap it up. Any final words you want to say before we do?
Well, I just would, I feel grateful that you and your organization, Buddha at the Gas Pump, has given us this opportunity to meet and discuss the spiritual path and its relationship to our own well-being and the well-being of the collective. And it really feels like an honor to us. And so thank you for this opportunity.
Oh, thank you. And incidentally, I'm sure you got it, but I've actually gotten a couple of emails over the years from people saying, how dare you put Buddha at the gas pump? Buddha is a god. This is profane to say this. But the whole implication of the title is that, in this day and age, people of all sorts are awakening, and quite ordinary looking people that you might be standing next to at a gas station could have some profound inner awakening. That's the reason.
I tell you, who wouldn't have been upset is the Buddha wouldn't be upset.
Yeah, he would have probably liked the title. He would have said, what's a gas pump?
Yeah.
Great.
And I also want to add my thanks, Rick, and your team, and thank you all very much, and the patience of getting all of the technology set up.
Yeah, thank you, because it is there's a lot involved sometimes in ironing all of the technical difficulties, and you're really busy, and you've been very patient in helping us work that out with you.
Oh, you're the guys doing it, but I also we do live in these extraordinarily challenging times. It's very intense. And I just wanted to encourage us all, even though we don't know the outcomes of, it's an incredible time to be around, actually. Yeah. But to encourage us all that it's not, it's not nothing to really work at the shifts of consciousness that we've been talking about and pointing to, that these have an incredible impact and can ripple out and contribute to these, as well as the engagement and activism that we're doing, contribute to these tipping points that I think we will see more and more in the next 10 years. We'll see an increase of intensity and destruction. But we're also going to see an increase of these awakening, this new world that's trying to be born. And so it's exciting. I'm glad we can share, talking about these themes and share this with your platform and your followers. Thank you for that.
Yeah. One final line from your book: we should not underestimate the deep, psychotic, patriarchal dinosaur that in its belligerence and hatred would rather see a burnt and tortured earth than give up its quest for domination. But you know what happened to the dinosaurs. So I have a feeling that, like you say, there's going to be some destruction and some collapsing of cherished structures and institutions and ways of living that really have proven their unworthiness to exist in a more enlightened world. And it should be an interesting time to live through.
That's right. Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Let me just make a couple of concluding remarks. So I've been speaking with Kittisaro and Thanissara, and hopefully got those pronunciations right after all this. And I will be linking to their website from their page on batgap.com and to their books and so on. So if you happen to be listening to this while you're driving in your car or something and you want to find them, just go to batgap.com, and then you'll see their page, or you can search for their page if you're listening to this for a year from now, and you can follow the links there to get to their site, to their books, and so on. This is an ongoing series, and if you'd like to be notified each time a new episode is posted, then subscribe on YouTube and/or subscribe to the little email notification thing that I send out every time there's a new interview. You'll see a place for that on Batgap. And also, I just mentioned audio podcasts. This exists as one of those as well as the videos. So if you'd like to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or one of those platforms, there's a podcast link on batgap.com and a bunch of other stuff if you explore the menus. So thanks for listening or watching, and we'll see you next week. And thank you, Kittisaro and Thanissara.
Thank you so much, Rick.
It's been a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your retreat, and please apologize to the folks attending it if I've kept you over time.
No, not at all.
Okay,
It's been great.
Thank you.
Bye.